The things that Jesus taught were not the things that were being taught about him, and that gradually led me to thinking, I'm not happy with the Christian creed, I'm not happy with the Trinitarian theology. I could never reconcile myself to why somebody else's death should save me from my sins. That didn't make sense to me. I was interested in the life of Jesus, and then when I started to study the prophets, they could have been brothers. I know they were in the same family tree, but the prophet, when I began to study his life, from his childhood, his adult life, everything about him I found so attractive and noble. They were so bothered about this detail, that detail. Are you compassionate? Are you honest? Are you generous? Are you brave? The noble Muslim life. These are the things that are important to me in Islam, which I could see so strongly in the Prophet and how he lived. What was important is the heart.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası başlıyor.
Sister Ruqaiyyah, Selamunaleyküm. Thank you so much for inviting us, let's say, having us here. Let's start with the story of your conversion to Islam.
My conversion to Islam. Yeah. It really started, I think, with my conversion to religion generally. I had an interesting experience when I was a child, 8 years old, and I had a feeling that I was being chosen for something, and I became a very religious little girl. But I was a Christian at that time, used to go to church, and I was not particularly happy with the church setup. I tried various things. I joined the Salvation Army, different places, I was seeking for it. And I went to university to study theology, so that was my profession, to be an RE teacher. I began to travel in the Middle East and to meet Muslim people, and I was very impressed with the way of life, and I loved all sorts of things about Islamic society. But I think my real conversion came when I was studying about the Pharisees in the Bible, and I thought, there's something not quite right about the way they're being presented, because they were always seen as the villains, yeah, as far as Jesus was concerned. And I felt, no, this was wrong, that from his beliefs Jesus seemed to be a Pharisee as far as I was concerned. And I began to think about things, think things through, and I came to a pretty strong conclusion. The things that Jesus taught were not the things that were being taught about him. It was different. The two things were different. And I began to sort of study in that area, and that gradually led me to thinking, I'm not happy with the Christian creed. I'm not happy with the Trinitarian theology. I was more happy with what Jesus taught, and that is that, when you ask for forgiveness, you are forgiven by God. And to think that God wouldn't forgive you, to me, seemed very wrong, very blasphemous. And he taught, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. When the man was in the gutter, he'd done everything wrong, and he's in the gutter, and he turns to God to ask for forgiveness. The father, representing God, it comes towards him on the road to meet him, and he's forgiven. And then I thought, the things that matter to me as a Christian, what Jesus taught, how do you know whether you're going on the right path or the wrong path? And it came down to another parable, the sheep and the goats. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I had no home, you took me in. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was a stranger, you didn't turn me away. And then I found, of course, a very similar hadith of the Prophet Muhammad as well. But, things like that it didn't need atonement theology. The Christian belief that Christ was God made man and he had to die to save us from our sins. Now, I didn't mind the bit about God made man. I was happy with that at that stage. But I could never reconcile myself to why somebody else's death should save me from my sins. That didn't make sense to me. So going along those lines, I found I was gradually edging more towards Islam. Funnily enough, it was my career as a writer that began to draw me into realising that I'd crossed a bridge from Christianity into Islam. I'd written several books. I was a teacher for a long time and taught GCE and GCSE religious studies, and I became quite well known, I suppose, for one or two Christian books that I produced for that market, educational market. And the Heinemann Press, as it was then, contacted me because in those days, the religious studies at school hardly included any comparative religion. It was nearly all Church of England-based biblical studies. And they wanted to start introducing world faiths. And really, in those days, there weren't any textbooks. Well, I never came across any textbooks anyway. So Heinemann asked me if I would like to try and take on researching Islam as a project. So I felt very flattered. I thought, yes, I would like to try that. So I started off, I became known at the local mosque. I got to know the imam there and quite a few other people I was researching. I had a questionnaire to hand round, just basic things really, to find out about Islam so that I could present it in simple language to kids 14 to 16 years old who were doing GCSE. And I suppose really with doing those studies, finding things out, meeting people, it gradually began to draw me in. And my travels began around about the same time. Sadly, also my divorce from my first husband happened around about that time, which it was a sad business, but it gave me a certain amount of freedom to do more what I wanted to do and to travel about. I went to Jerusalem and all around Palestine in I forget which year it was now, but around about that same time. And that was an eye-opener to me because I began to get interested in politics as well. I knew nothing about all those things there, and I was quite shocked by some of the things I saw there, particularly with the way the Palestinians were treated. One thing led to another, and I just began to be more and more drawn into Islam, and I was accepted by the local people here.
When did you take your Shahada?
That would be 1986. Everything. When I started writing, I was interested in the life of Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus, and I did work on that. And then when I started to study the prophets, they could have been brothers. I know they were in the same family tree, same 100 square miles of land. They lived there. They were on the same family line. But the prophet, when I began to study his life, from his childhood to his adult life, his teenage life, everything about him I found so attractive and noble and amazing. And it occurred to me that the prophet must be one of the most studied in detail people in history, because whereas when you study the life of Jesus, you've got very little to go on in ancient texts and background, very little. But for the prophet, from the moment he accepted prophethood, his whole life was completely devoted to the will of God, a life of prayer, everything about him. His life must have changed completely. And he was only a boy. I mean, I'm an old woman now, but what was he, 25, I believe, was he? And then to marry a woman of 40, because I'm very interested in the female side of things, obviously, but to marry a woman who'd had 3 husbands, I believe, already when she married him. She was 40, he's a boy of 25, but he just had this amazing thing happen to him. And his family background was good. His grandfather was the guardian of the Kaaba. A lot of people don't realise that the Kaaba and those old traditions predate the Prophet Muhammad by centuries and centuries. They sort of think it all happened at one thing, but it goes back, to Abraham. And the Prophet, as a young man, starting an order of chivalry. Or maybe, I don't know if he started it, I believe his uncle started it. But one of the founder members of this order of chivalry, helping the poor, helping the widows, trying to see justice done when women were being abused, pitching in and saving them and helping them practically doing wonderful things. As a teenager, I believe he was 17 or 18, something like that, when he started Hilfal Fudul, this order of chivalry. Oh, there are so many things I found out, because I've done seerah work, you see, on the Prophet, but his first love, he couldn't marry her because his uncle felt he wasn't good enough in a way. He wanted a more influential marriage for the girl, so the heartbreak that he went through. And then to finally, you know, when he did marry Khadija, this much older woman, very well respected, lovely woman, wealthy, you know, and the work he did for her and the travelling and everything. There was just so much. Mainly, well, that book arose out of the Muslim Women's Association. And I was connected with that. One of my dear friends, Zarina Chowdhury, she was one of the founder people of the Helping Muslim Women, mainly a Pakistani Bangladeshi background. She herself married a Pakistani man. And there were all sorts of problems that were going on that were really based on Muslim men abusing their own faith in the way they treated their women folk. It led to so many things. Things like, you know, people criticise Islam because a word of a witness is accepted, but you have to have 2 witnesses if you're a woman. How wrong must that be? Until you discover that the people that were cheating women mostly were their own husbands, their bosses, you know, people like that. They were being exploited. So, you know, very sensible, have 2 witnesses to protect the woman, not to denigrate them in any way, but to protect them. So I thought, yes, that's very sensible. But the things about the Prophet in that book, I believe there's a chapter in there about the Prophet's wives, because another thing that Islam is always criticised for is the issue of polygamy, that the Prophet must have been a lascivious, sex-crazed man to have all these beautiful women, until you find out that most of the women he married were middle-aged widows, you know, not beautiful young virgin girls, but women in their 50s. And of course he didn't marry, he married Khadija and never had another woman until she died. So I believe their marriage was about 23, 25 years, something like that. And then when he remarried, his first wife he married after that was a woman round about the same age as himself, one of the first Muslim women, Sauda, you know, with a whole history of wonderful stories, these ladies, that a lot of people just don't know them. And he did have one very young wife, Aisha, but he knew her from birth, and she was the daughter of his best friend. People are funny about it because they feel, well, he married this girl so young. I've argued her age when she actually married him. I think that is controversial. Yes. Normally, you know, in many Islamic societies, when a girl becomes able to have children, counted as an adult, and the safest and most respectable thing is to arrange a decent marriage for her. So she could be 9, 10, 11, 12, up to 18, something like that. But as soon as she becomes fertile, it seems a good idea and sensible to help her find a decent, good husband. If it doesn't work, fine, get divorced. Your second husband, third husband, fourth husband, your own choice. But, you know, the idea of I think most of the young girls seem to have been between 13 and 15 when they married, and boys would have been 16 to 18. Marriage is a hard work. It's not easy. I've had the pleasure of being married 3 times. My English husband, I married him, I was about 24, 25, something like that. We were married 23 years. And then I had another husband, and it was a short-lived marriage. He was a Sudanese man working in Amman, in Jordan. And I married him out there. And he was a lovely man, but it was impossible to fetch him here. There's a whole history to that, which is very private, and I wouldn't reveal it. And then my third husband, Ruqaiyyah Waris Maqsood, I'd gone to Pakistan and I met him there, and we were married 10 years. I was very, very happy with him, but unfortunately we went into the polygamy issue head on, and I'm afraid it all flew up. And he's still very much on the go. I think he's been married several times since our divorce. But we were married 10 years, and they were 10 good years, and I don't regret it at all. But every time you marry, you're living with somebody, there are challenges, there are, compromises that you have to make. When you marry, you have to care about that person. And I believe Imam Ghazali's sayings, one of the hadiths of the Prophet recorded by him, that the Prophet had said, the man who satisfies his need of her before he satisfies her need of him is not one of us. It's unselfishness, it's concern for your partner. And it's not a sort of mushy, romantic love, it's more down to earth, it's more basic. You get to respect that person and you form a life with them. So although I suppose the sexual aspect is important and it certainly comes into that book, but it's compromise and charity towards your partner and commitment towards your partner. It's so difficult because I can only really talk about England and the UK. Different cultures have their own problems. But you're talking about parents of Muslim children?
Yes.
My main contact with teenagers, of course, came from my teaching career. I taught for years and years, mainly boys, funnily enough. So, I knew a lot, hundreds and hundreds of teenagers been through the classroom. But for parents of teenagers, of Muslim teenagers, it's difficult now because so many of the Muslims in this country, of course, are not actually English native born. They've come from different countries, and particularly in the north of England, I think from Mirpur and Bangladesh, Pakistan, they come with their own culture and their own traditions and their own way of seeing things. And I must admit, when I was travelling about the world, I found that in every country I went, the Muslims were slightly different. Depended, the Turkish ones were different from the Moroccans or from the Finland Muslim, the different countries of the world where Islam was. But particularly, I think, with the Muslim community that came here, they seemed to be concentrated by language groups. And I often found that the people of one particular race didn't really connect with those of another race. So it was quite interesting. I realise I'm beginning to ramble now again, but for example, I went to Finland, where a large number of the Muslims there, original Muslims, were Tatar Muslims, and yet where I went, they were Somali. And the Imam who had invited me to go there, he was a Somali man, the congregation was Somali, a very Somali sort of culture, and they'd never been to the Tatar mosque that was down the road. And on the second day of my trip there, the lady who had actually invited me, she was a Finnish lady married to a Egyptian man, and they'd invited me to come from the UK to talk to them. And she said on the second day of this event, only Muslims who spoke Finnish could come to the event. And the Imam he said, well, there won't be anybody here, it's ridiculous, because the Somali Muslims don't speak Finnish. Anyway, it went ahead, and to his amazement, the place was full of a whole load of Finnish. He had no idea existed. So I felt, if I can bring this back to the UK now, here you get little groups of mosques and entities that don't really seem to relate to the others. And I think also a lot of not realising how many UK people have become Muslims, and the feeling that, like, here I am dressed up in all my finery. I'm not really English. I've got an Arab thing on, and I'm dressed up, but that's because I'm a woman. I know I'm an old woman, but I still like dressing up, and I like the Arab clothing. But for the teenagers in the UK, a lot of them are growing away from their background culture. And so you see teenagers being pulled into a lot of things that are totally un-Islamic, and the big problems, drugs, of course, alcohol, sex, and all these things, pulling them away. And some of them they can't even relate to their own grandparents anymore. That things are changing so rapidly. And sadly for me, I'm afraid I left all that world about 20 years ago, so I'm out of it now. I'm aware of the current situations like I used to be, when I was in teaching. But lots and lots of problems for young Muslims wanting to become Western, Western ones wanting to become Muslims and not being accepted. And the idea, so many problems. I think it's very important for Muslims to give good leadership. I must admit, when I was coming into Islam, I was quite surprised that there was a lot of emphasis, for example, in the madrasa, you have to learn the Quran in Arabic, but they didn't understand it. They didn't speak Arabic. I thought, well, this is very strange. Why not spend madrasa time learning how to speak Arabic, and then you can just read the Quran like a book? Why spend all this effort and time learning it by heart? It's good in itself, not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I found out that so many people didn't understand the khutbah. They didn't understand, you know, what was going on. I thought, well, the emphasis seems wrong here. But what we need is instead of Islam, if I can go back to my Pharisees, where the Pharisees went wrong, they were Pharisaic. They became extremists. They were so bothered about this detail, that detail, you know, all those things, that what was important is the heart. Are you compassionate? Are you honest? Are you noble? Are you generous? Are you brave? You know, those things, the noble Muslim life. I think the Arabic, I don't actually speak Arabic. Futua, I believe, is the word for it, of noble living. Honesty, integrity, you know, these are the things that are important to me in Islam, which I could see so strongly in the Prophet and how he lived. Everything he did, you know, he was honest and courageous, noble, the ideal knight. And that's what we need to see in Islam. Extremism horrifies me. Jihadists horrifies me. Your jihad in life is to live in the world but not be tainted by the bad things in the world, but to try and make this world a better place. And you can only do that really by being absolutely yourself, honest, noble, generous, compassionate. These are what Islam is about to me, the heart. The heart has to be right. And then it doesn't really matter if you get details wrong, if you do this prayer wrong, you do that bit wrong. I was always told, you know, when I was coming into Islam, oh, that's wrong, you do that wrong. You know, when I was a teacher at school, I used to have a Friday prayer group, and we started off with a couple of kids, and we just used to make a little space in the classroom and say our prayers together. And then it gradually grew, and I ended up with about a dozen or so, dozen to 15 boys. And I wouldn't lead the prayers. I mean, I have led the prayers for women, but one of the boys would lead the prayers, and I'd be at the back and encouraging them to do this and the other. And that went perfectly until one day, one of the other little Muslim boys turned up. Oh, this is wrong, that's wrong, da da da, everything's wrong. I said, what does God matter? Does it matter to God? What matters is that they are praying, that we are here, we're trying to establish something. You know, and if you get a detail wrong, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, is he going to criticise? Is he going to be upset? You know, it's the simple heart that matters to me, the simple, straightforward. How can you call yourself a Muslim if you're nasty about people, if you beat your wife, if you fiddle your books in business, if you do all these things? That is anti-Islam. That's what's wrong. So we do need our leaders and our people to be good role models. Your skills are God-given. I mean, it's up to you whether you have a skill or not. God gives you that. You do the best. But you can just be a simple soul and be true in your heart. And that, I think, is what really matters. How to achieve unity amongst the Muslims? Probably stop trying to achieve unity amongst the Muslims. I've come from a Christian background, so I've known the Church of England, Roman Catholics, Quakers, Salvation Army, loads and loads of different sorts of Christians. But what unites them is they all believe in God. They all believe in God. Now, when I've come into Islam, you've got Sunni, Shiite, my brain's going now, but so many different, Deobandi, Wahhabi, Sufi. You know, I think it would be more difficult to get unity between a Wahhabi and a Sufi, or a Sunni and a Shiite. There's so points of difference. But what is important in Islam is to come to that which is common. That's what matters. I love the Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. You take away the walls and it's the same light that shines in all these different courtyards. It's the same light. You've got to concentrate on the light, not the walls. So again, coming back to the characteristics of the noble person, the noble Muslim, that's what is important. And if you happen to believe this particular little thing here or that thing there, that doesn't really matter. We won't know the truth of it until we lose our free will to have all these differences. I can believe what I like. I can believe a dozen impossible things before breakfast. It doesn't matter. I could be completely wrong. But we have the free will to believe what we like while we're here and while we're alive. And once you cross that barrier, after that, you kick the bucket, you fall off the shelf. You've lost that free will because either there is nothing.
Or something.
Or you're in it and you have to face it. There it is. And whatever you believed in your lifetime, I presume you see things entirely differently, once that barrier is crossed.
You've been in Palestine?
Yes, so I did these.
Oh, did you?
This is my embroidery.
Oh, that's your embroidery?
Yes. While I was married briefly to Zane, I did a lot of these. No, when I went to Palestine, I'm sorry, I've mixed myself up now. That was when I was in Jordan.
Okay.
That I did that. When I was in Palestine, I was there as a tourist, and it was before I had accepted Islam. And it was interesting because I went with a group of people who believed in psychic experiences. So it was quite interesting to go with that group of people. But we went to Jerusalem, and instead of going to the normal touristic places, we stayed on the hill opposite the Haram, and it was the Palestinian hotel, Palestinian side of things. So we lived with them. And then when we went to Galilee, we went up there to Galilee, and we were with Palestinian peoples. But I think what hit me most of all there was the tension. I mean, it was when did I go? I can't remember the year I went now.
70s?
Would be 70s, yes, in the 70s. And there was so much, there was 1967, there was a war there. Yes. And there was a lot of hostility. And I believe we were the last coach party that went to Hebron. We'd gone down there to see the relics of Abraham, and just people shook the coach. They were quite hostile. And I didn't know why they were hostile to the British. I knew nothing about all that history. And then I came back and I realised, what had happened and what had gone on. But the Palestinians were very much looked down on at that time. They had a lot of troubles, but things have changed. But the problem's still there, of course. The problem's still there. And I feel that it's a pity, really, that the Jewish people didn't live up to what, to me, would have been real Judaism. And that is, you conquer territory, you should give it back in a Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is gone. It was never given back. And all those things that they just ignored, and they treated the Palestinians very badly when I was there. I remember, if I could tell you one traveller's tale, having to go to the toilet somewhere, and there was a public toilet, and it was a knocked down sort of place with holes in the wall and everything, and the whole Israeli encampment round it, and the men were sitting there with their legs in the way. You had to jump over their legs. I was dressed in Arabic costume, and you had to climb over all these people to get to the actual public toilets. And when I was in the public toilet, they were looking through the holes in the wall. I mean, it was a horrible experience. And I went out and I was full of fight. I was going to have a go at the commanding officer. And the chap who was leading our party had to calm me down, said, no, don't make any trouble, keep quiet. But silly little things like that, that's just a traveller's tale. But it shook me up. I thought, wow, I hadn't expected that. And then the cultural thing as well, when we were down in Jerusalem, the culture there was fairly modest, and then you go up to Galilee, and from a lovely, quiet, modest Palestinian background, to see women in bikinis and shirts walking around the streets, shock. I thought, oh, culture shock here. I loved Turkey. I flew to, must have been flown to Istanbul, I think. Flew to Istanbul, and then we went all the way right across to Ankara, and then right across to Cappadocia. I saw all the stuff there, and the highlight, I think the moment of my life really, was to see the dawn at the top of Nimrut Dag.
Okay.
I've done that. It was the most wonderful experience, and something I did that you can't do now. There, at the top of Nimrut Dag there's a pyramid of rubble, and you can't go up it now, I believe, and I've stood on the top of that and watched the dawn. I love Turkey. And then we came back along the bottom coast. I didn't do the Ephesus side of it. I missed that, and I missed the Black Sea. But I think all the rest of it I did do. And we only had one posh night. That was at Silifke, where we stayed in a nice hotel. But all the rest of it was very, very simple. I went there with a group. It was like a geographical expedition.
Okay.
But it was, you know, and Jalaluddin Rumi, I went there. I didn't know very many Turkish young people, but I did know Bosnian young people, and they seemed to me to be very similar. I don't know how close Bosnia and Turkey really are, but I went to Bosnia just after the war. I went twice to Bosnia, and that, of course, was a huge experience. You know, it was so shattering. But what I loved about Bosnia young people was the way the women seemed to outnumber the men in the mosques. And oh, they studied together. They would sit together in the class, do everything together. It wasn't all this, oh, you must be separated by a curtain. It was much more relaxed. And our Turkish young people, it's difficult for me to say anything because I never really met any. I only went there as a tourist, so I don't know. But
you know, in the world now we have all these young Muslims. Your advice as an educator?
Go back to the source. Go back to the source. I think the Quran is the source of all this. That is what matters. And when I was trying to study Sharia, you know, to find out that there's not just right and wrong. There's compulsory and forbidden, recommended, disrecommended, whatever the word is, and then left to your conscience in the middle. Try and be wide-ranging in your thoughts, but to go back always to the Quran. If the Quran says it's all right, it's all right. If it says it's wrong, it's wrong. But I think things like the beard, men's beards, is it so important? Is this headscarf so important? Not to me. To me, it's the person that matters. And when you get people who you know, your beard must be longer than the hand. And yet when I read the hadith, it was the other way around. The Prophet said the beard shouldn't be longer. Once it gets longer, cut it. That should be your limit. Keep tidy, not this bushy thing, you know, but all this fuss and palaver about fard and surur, all this, that and the other. What matters is you as a person and your love for God and to believe in God. Either there is a God or there isn't. Very simple choice. If there isn't, well, okay, live your life, be a good person, try to make the world better. But there could be. There could be a God, there could be life after death, there could be angels watching you. If you have 2 angels, then we are 6 people in my room now. There could be at least 12 angels in here with us. You know, you've got to think what you're saying. And they're recording you, and they're seeing you, and they can see into your heart. So if you're a young Muslim, try not to be too obsessed with details of, you know, but build your character, and be true. Well, mainly the prejudice of non-Muslims about Muslims, that's mainly, I think, misinformation about Islam. And I can only speak for my own culture here. I think in this country, people don't like people who show off. They don't like people who are holier than you are. I'm a better person than you are. That grates in the UK character. They don't like that. And so sometimes with Muslims, you have this feeling that some Muslims are trying to win a competition. I'm a better Muslim than you are because I've done this and I've said so many extra prayers and I've chanted this verse 2,000 times. What a waste of time to me. You know, you could be doing something different with your time than chanting a phrase over and over and over and over again. So what? you know, live your life better. But so many of the things that non-Muslims criticise Islam for are not Islamic at all. Like, if I can mention something bluntly, female genital mutilation. Oh, what a terrible thing that is in Islam. Of course it isn't in Islam at all. It pre-existed before Islam in certain cultures. It has nothing to do with Islam. So many of these things, you can criticise certain Muslim individuals for what they do in their life and their behaviour, but that is not Islam. So if you read that a sultan had 1,000 concubines, that is not Islam. That's a complete wrong.
Basically, it's ignorance.
Ignorance, yes, ignorance of what Islam actually is. Yes.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası sona erdi.